And now to discuss the future of Kashmir, let's meet our panel. Here in the studio, Shuja Nawaz, a distinguished fellow at South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Also with us, Sadanand Dhume, a resident fellow at American Enterprise Institute. And from London, we welcome author Nitasha Kaul. She is also here in Washington, D.C. is James Schwemlein. He is a non-resident scholar for South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Nitasha, I want to start with you in London. You saw the story that our correspondents just had, but this ongoing violence is really nothing new for the people of Kashmir. Tell us what kind of circumstances they live under.
Well, their circumstances are absolutely the worst, and it is the most militarized place anywhere. And they have to live under this state of perpetually being besieged, and with their political demands being addressed by cycles of revenge, and uprisings met with by revenge, and often with brutal force, as we saw in 2016 when pellet guns were used on protesters. And even today, I mean, while the world talks about India and Pakistan and the political leadership in these two countries, the key issues for Kashmir, where in fact traders observed a shutdown today, are the constitutional amendments, the shutdown of schools run by Jamaat-e-Islami, and various other such local issues, because after every such incident, the people of Kashmir just feel more and more pushed against a wall, and all of this just sets up the incentives for further violence. So I'm amazed at how people are surprised when things like this happen, because clearly there is a pattern to how this grows and develops. There's a whole generation there that's grown up knowing nothing else but militarization and brutalization.
Shuja, I want to ask you, getting people to step back from the abyss, if you will, and find a peaceful path forward. Pakistani Prime Minister did return the pilot, as we just saw in that story, but a former Pakistani ambassador to the U.S., Hussein Haqqani, he wrote an article for the Washington Post, and we have a quote here I'd like to read, get your reaction to this. Pakistan's 30-year strategy of supporting insurgents and militants in Kashmir has failed. Pakistan's policy has made life more difficult for the Kashmiri Muslims it claims to support. What do you make of that?
That's one part of the story, and just one part of the story. I think what we heard from our colleague in London is the other and much more important part of the story in my reckoning, because till you change the landscape in Kashmir, you're going to create the conditions that will allow militants, whether from inside Kashmir or from Pakistan bases, to take advantage of that. Even while the current imbroglio was going on and developing into a almost nuclear brinksmanship, we had reports from Kashmir of the arrest of Yasin Malik and members of his family. Mm-hmm. I got a frantic message from his wife, who's in Pakistan, saying that this had happened and that his mother had been left out in the middle of the night for 5 hours in the snow. So that's not the kind of policy that is conducive to solving the problem between the two countries. That said, I think what Mr. Haqqani is saying is quite right, that Pakistan needs to have a basic introspective look and a change in direction in terms of militant groups that use its soil to operate outside its borders. It has a scheme under the National Action Plan. They had geo-targeted well over 200 sites in the Punjab, for instance. So they've identified those sites. The action has not been taken against them, and that will be a very necessary first step.
Sadanand, we have to take the big picture of this. You have these two nations that have hundreds of nuclear weapons that could be aimed at each other. Pakistani ambassador to the U.S. made some comments about the situation. I want you to hear what the ambassador had to say.
The international community cannot afford to continue getting it wrong. It must recognize that the real cause of regional instability in South Asia is the unresolved dispute of Kashmir. It is time to address the oldest dispute on the UN Security Council's agenda.
But looking at India, it has always insisted this is an internal matter. Do you think India did make a mistake by sending its fighter jets into the Pakistani-controlled area?
I'll get to that, but let me first respond to the Pakistani ambassador's comments. I think this is precisely what has really put the region in many ways in this dangerous position, because you have these two completely different ways of looking at this, right? And these are historically embedded, and the Pakistanis view the essential problem as Kashmir being an unsettled issue. And the Indians view this essentially as, look, if the Pakistanis were not funding, aiding, and training all kinds of terrorist groups and allowing their fighters to come across and target Indian targets, then Kashmir would normalize, right? So these are positions that cannot be reconciled. What has changed over here, and this is really the heart of what's happening right now, is that India under Narendra Modi, for various reasons, feels that the old Indian approach, which essentially showed a measure of restraint after one of these attacks, that has not worked, and that India will now up the tempo in retaliation. That is what is dramatically different, where you have India
and
trying
what led to this, do you think?
Well, it's cumulative. The most recent is obviously the attack on February 14th in Pulwama, but there's a long history, right, including the Mumbai attacks and an attack on Indian Parliament.
In 2008.
Right. So now what you have is India, which is attempting to draw red lines. And you have Pakistan, which is reacting. It's not entirely clear whether the red lines that India is trying to draw have been successfully drawn. So there is this room for miscalculation on both sides, and that is what leads to the possibility of escalation. Do I think India was wrong in retaliating as it did? No. I think that was fine. But I do think that both sides, you need responsible people on both sides to look into this. And I think that if Pakistan does indeed crack down on these groups, which it's promised to do many times over the past 2 decades, if it is for real, then I think that would be one useful step towards diffusing this.
James, I want to turn to you because basically the world kind of took a collective sigh this weekend when the pilot was returned and everybody thought, we have stepped back from the precipice. But you have an article out today in Foreign Policy, and you say, let's not jump to conclusions just yet. You have some very real concerns moving forward.
Yeah, I think they build exactly on what Sadanand was just saying. The point here is not whether India was right or wrong to retaliate. I think they're well within their rights to proportionally retaliate against the largest casualty attack in Kashmir in 3 decades. The point is that on all sides of this, on the part of the terrorists that conducted the attack, on the part of India, who for the first time since 1971 conducted airstrikes into Pakistan, and on the part of Pakistan, which retaliated again across the line of control into India, the level of violence has increased, and that should concern all of us. And that continuing level of escalation is going to pick up the next time there's an attack, and there will be one, unfortunately. I think as much as has been discussed here about the situation in Kashmir, the root of this continues to be Pakistan's facilitation, enabling, and support for terror groups operating from Pakistani territory and threatening their neighbors.
Nitasha, I see you want to weigh in, and I want to hear your thoughts on this and more about Kashmir, but we have a brief explainer I'd like our audience to look at first that may put this in a bit more perspective for us.
Sure. Okay.
The mountainous region of Kashmir has been a flashpoint between India and Pakistan for more than 7 decades. 1947, the partition of India and birth of Pakistan. Because of its location, Kashmir was free to join either country. Kashmir's population was mainly Muslim, but the local ruler was Hindu. He chose India. That October, Pakistan sent troops in. The first full-scale Indo-Pakistani war over Kashmir had erupted. 2 years later, a UN ceasefire came into effect. A line of control was established, with about 2/3 of the disputed territory under Indian administration, the rest under Pakistan. Now, it was meant to only be temporary, but that de facto border remains to this day. India and Pakistan have fought 2 wars over Kashmir, and they came to the brink in 1999 for a 2-month conflict after they'd become nuclear powers. Ongoing violence has killed at least 47,000 people since 1989. That's by India's official count. Some human rights groups say the real figure is twice that.
Nitasha, I want to get you to weigh in on what our guests have had to say so far and how you think this is going to play moving forward.
Thank you. So I do want to actually challenge the perception that either India or Pakistan have actually got a strong case on Kashmir for their policies. I think both India and Pakistan have a weak case for a weak cause when it comes to Kashmir. Both of these countries have actually, at various times just had this existential obsession with territory of Kashmir. Now, in a sense, it's understandable because decolonization and the events of the partition and its aftermath has meant that the idea of the nation and the state are very improperly aligned in that region. So it's understandable. But to go on not learning from history and to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result is just silly. I mean, the support of terrorism ultimately hurts Pakistan, and the brutalization of the Kashmiri population enables the banalization of violence in India. So both of these countries actually have failed with their policies towards Kashmir because it has been seen simply through a discourse of possession or liberation. And the point here is that it is not an intractable conflict. It is a conflict that is being made intractable by vested interests, but most importantly, even more than that, because peace can be profitable, can be argued profitable, more importantly, through this kind of entrenched perceptions that, that partly through scholarly work, partly through political actors, there's this entrenched perception around Kashmir, which is that this is an India-Pakistan issue. And in all of that, especially from the 90s onwards, the Kashmiri population is the distance between their imaginary and the Indian and Pakistani imaginary is just immense. And an attack like this only brings to the fore, and for me, this is very central. The Indian army chief saying in 2017 that he would wish that Kashmiris would take up guns instead of stones because then they could be dealt with in the way that they wanted. So there is a push towards violence. In fact, contrary to the standard idea, the state here does not want a monopoly on violence. Its interests are best served by a greater competition when it comes to the fact of violence. Now, the key thing for me again and again is to reiterate the solution must come from bottom up, and without involving the Kashmiris, without there being dialogue, a solution cannot even be dreamt about. Both India and Pakistan have realized ever more that their policies aren't working, and going forward, I mean, I think as one of your other commentators said there, we've just, I say we've just pressed a pause button. This is not going to go away. If you keep pushing a population against the wall, refusing to recognize the level of alienation, what do you actually, I mean, it's actually, heaven forbid, these are very sad facts to contemplate, that somehow for narrow electoral or other interests, we can go on creating such great levels of insecurity in a region where economic ties could be helping both of these countries. So I fear going forward that this is just a very temporary pause in the violence. And I think for that reason alone, the Indian elections are crucial, because this kind of policy being exacerbated will make everything so much worse.
Nitasha,
just jump.
You get an idea of the passion, though, hearing.
Absolutely. I understand the passion, and I have a great degree of empathy for the passion, and no one's taking away from that. But the fact is that you cannot wish away the fact that India and Pakistan are large states with nuclear weapons, with armies, with national narratives. They're not going to, you can't, I can understand the desire to sort of, have just the Kashmiri people in focus and then have India and Pakistan and actors in sort of soft focus, but that's simply not reality. In reality, if we want to step forward, we're going to have to deal with the fact that these are national issues for 1.3 billion Indians and 220 million Pakistanis.
With that in mind, Shuja, if you think about
can I just briefly say something? Can I just briefly make a point?
Jump in.
I do not want it to be seen as something that is only coming from a position of Kashmir and passion. I do think that we have to look at this in terms of strategy. It's very poor strategy, for example, what India has done over the last few days. What has it achieved except ensuring greater insecurity with no tangible results, and perhaps only benefit could be electoral popularity for Modi-led BJP. So this is making Indians a lot more insecure.
Well, it's not just that. Shuja, if you think Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan ran saying he wants to tackle corruption, he wants to work on the economy, and he wants to make peace with India. He's been in 6 months now. What kind of grade card would you give him at this point?
It's too early to grade him on this because you can't have one hand clapping. The good news out of Pakistan was that the talks as well as the visits related to the Kartarpur corridor, which would allow Sikh pilgrims to come to Pakistan without any let or hindrance, is proceeding. So there's some good news on that score. But I think the broader issue, and this is one perhaps that Natasha was thinking about, both countries have a huge opportunity cost in economic terms from this conflict. And a few years ago, my colleague Mohan Guruswamy and I did a study on this, on the opportunity cost of conflict between India and Pakistan. This was at the urging and support of Secretary George Shultz. And we came to the conclusion that they were losing something like 1.5% equivalent of GDP every year, which if you take the real economy of both countries is roughly equal to what each of them spends on their defense. So that's the amount, $7 billion roughly for Pakistan and multiples of that for India, which they could better spend on their people. Secondly,
Absolutely.
and this is much more important on a global scale, something for the US to pay attention to, much of the recent research indicates that it's not countries, but regional groupings of countries that create economic opportunities across the globe. And the United States, unfortunately, has not stepped up to the plate. It has, in this particular instance, supported muscularity on the part of India by saying that it's okay to have a preemptive strike. You fall into this tactical trap of gaining some kind of self-respect by saying we will respond, and then the other side responds. The critical thing that happened in this particular juncture was that the Indian aircraft actually penetrated Pakistani airspace and not into Pakistani-administered Kashmir alone. And that, I think, is very dangerous brinksmanship.
James, I want to bring you in as well, because we're talking about the international community that could weigh in on this. And the headline from your article was the Trump administration, with the America First policies, kind of steering clear of that. But you make a valid point that Saudi Arabia, China, and other nations could step in and be more proactive. Would that be welcome, and what could be the positive end of all of that?
Well, that is exactly the problem here, and that India feels that they can handle this dispute all by themselves. They're the larger, the stronger, the more capable, and the faster growing power. So they don't particularly want other countries meddling in their relationship with a relatively weaker neighbor. And Pakistan, on the other hand, is begging for that international attention. So that dynamic, that diplomatic dynamic is exactly the dance that's happened for decades. In this case, stability on the subcontinent is a goal of many countries, of China, of Saudi Arabia, of the UAE, of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of other stakeholders. And that's exactly what's been threatened by this circumstance. On the first hand, by the Pakistan-facilitated terrorism that started this crisis, and also by the escalating level of violence that's been deployed by both sides in continuing it over the last several weeks.
Sean, let me just add a wrinkle to that, to what James said. I mean, I agree that the formal Indian position is that it doesn't want mediation. But if you actually look at India's strategy, particularly since 2016, when this is the first time India did what it called a surgical strike, essentially, India relies on this idea that India will retaliate, essentially leans very heavily on an Indian belief, which has been backed up, that the international community views India's retaliation sympathetically. And you saw that in reactions from the US, from France and Australia and so on. And even China, which has sort of traditionally been quite close to Pakistan, did not condemn India on this sort of at first blush. So you see that what India may say that it doesn't want mediation, but it certainly expects the weight of international opinion to weigh on Pakistan to get it to change its policies.
Sadanand, I want to hear what Prime Minister Modi said just Friday, because that kind of plays right into what you're talking about, that he felt he could go in there perhaps with impunity and be embraced by the international community. Hear what he had to say.
In terms of tariff and terrorism has been curtailed, and it is going to be curtailed even more. This is a new India. This is an India that will return the damage done by terrorists with interest.
Well, not the best audio, but he basically vowed to revenge. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is really central to Modi's political persona. He was elected partly as an economic modernizer, but also as a strongman. And one of his promises was that he will change India, and India will no longer turn the other cheek. And that has been the central criticism of Mr. Modi and his party of the previous government. So, for instance, you had the Mumbai attacks, and India did not retaliate. And this is something that resonates very deeply with the Indian public. So the politics aligns in a way where there is not only pressure, there's tremendous pressure on the Indian government to respond now. And that, I think, is what has what has changed quite dramatically in the last 2 years, if you take the sort of long view of this conflict.
Shuja, I also want to get your opinion on what's the end game as far as Pakistan is considered.
I think it should be the same end game for both India and Pakistan, which is the improvement of the lives of their people. Both countries need to create jobs for their people. But looking at the longer term perspective, and even longer term than what my friends here are talking about, India has been saying it doesn't want international intervention, but India has always been the first one to seek international courts of appeal to bring these issues to the United Nations. In '65, when the Run of Kutch war took place, they were the first to approach the UK to mediate. When the '65 war was ending, they approached the Soviet Union to mediate and agree on an agreement in Tashkent. So traditionally, India has sought international intervention on its terms when it suited it. And I think it suits both countries to bring in international interlocutors. And maybe that's the way forward. But as James's piece indicates, the United States has lost this opportunity. And the muscularity of the US foreign policy is now being transmitted across the globe to regional conflicts, and that's not a good thing for anyone.
Nitasha, we've talked a great deal about India and Pakistan, what they want out of all this. But bring us up to date about the future of the Kashmir region. Why aren't leaders in the Kashmiri area invited to the table?
Well, they're not invited to the table because I think there is distrust on the part of both Indian and Pakistani leadership that the Kashmiris might want something that is not either India or Pakistan. We haven't had very many comprehensive assessments of what they do actually want, but if we go by the slogans that are chanted non-stop, which is Hum Kya Chahte Azadi, what do we want, freedom, or by the long time ago Chatham House study, then there's clearly a drive for autonomy, especially amongst the youth. So I think neither side is maybe able to trust the Kashmiris themselves, which is part of that whole process of wanting to possess or liberate them. But I think the international community can only go on ignoring this at its peril, because it increases regional insecurity and can have, and these networks do not just stay regional, as we know, and it's just, I mean, in a sense, facilitating Modi or not doing enough to understand the toxic brand of politics that is being encouraged in India at this point is going to hurt everyone, because it's going to polarize. India is a very large country with a very significant minority population, including of Muslims. So this kind of thing is going to create a lot more problems. We've already seen a severe restrictions, a severity of destitution, of
Nitasha,
all kinds of attacks
I would love to go on and on, but we are
India, of people not being able to even speak out in favor
issue.
of peace. So this kind of thing won't help. And he's not a neoliberal modernizer either. I mean,
understood,
yes,
Nitasha. I would love to hear more, but I'm sorry, we are out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been a very engaging discussion. That does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Caleb here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us, everyone.